10 Ways Americans Avoided the Draft During the Vietnam War. From sudden weddings to fleeing the country, young men sought creative ways to avoid military service during the Vietnam War. On August 26, 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson revoked the exemption for married men, triggering a wave of last-minute weddings. Courthouses, especially in cities like Las Vegas, saw a surge of couples rushing to marry before the deadline. During the war, nearly 60% of eligible men took some action to avoid conscription, using legal loopholes, medical claims, and even international escapes. Here are the 10 most common strategies they employed to avoid the draft. Number 1. Enlisting in another branch of the military. Many young men joined branches like the Navy, Air Force, or Coast Guard as a strategy to avoid the Army or Marines, which were more likely to deploy soldiers into direct combat zones in Vietnam. These branches had selective entry standards, requiring physical aptitude, background checks, or technical skills. Programs such as the National Guard or the Reserve Officers Training Corps, ROTC, also provided alternatives. Between 1964 and 1973, records show that nearly 15% of the men who enlisted did so primarily to avoid conscription into combat-heavy units. This tactic provided some level of control over how and where they served, as these branches offered roles that were typically non-combat in nature. Number 2. Registering as a conscientious objector. Before 1970, the only way to secure conscientious objector (CO) status was to prove membership in pacifist religious groups, such as the Quakers or Jehovah's Witnesses. The landmark Supreme Court decision in Welsh v. United States, 1970, broadened the criteria, ruling that moral or philosophical objections to war without religious affiliation qualified for CO status. Applications surged following the ruling, with 170,000 men applying during the Vietnam War. However, the process remained strict. In 1971 alone, about 61,000 men were granted CO status. Many turned to organizations like the American Friends Service Committee for help navigating the extensive paperwork and appeals. Yet, rejection rates were high, and many CO applicants had to endure multiple layers of appeals to receive exemptions. Number 3. Getting married and having children. Before 1965, marriage provided men with a temporary deferment from military service, allowing them to avoid conscription. However, on August 26, 1965, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed an executive order that eliminated marriage as grounds for deferment. Afterward, only fatherhood offered a chance at exemption. This shift led to a sharp rise in births, as couples sought to secure deferments through parenthood. President John F. Kennedy's earlier policy of granting 3A hardship deferments to men with children had already caused a noticeable increase in fertility rates. By 1970, the U.S. birth rate had jumped 13% compared to pre-war levels, with some families even timing pregnancies to coincide with draft board decisions. Research found that women whose husbands had low draft lottery numbers were 40% more likely to become pregnant. However, this strategy was not foolproof. In 1970, President Richard Nixon removed automatic parental deferments, introducing a requirement that fathers demonstrate financial hardship to qualify. As a result, many men found themselves drafted despite having children, and others were forced to pursue alternate methods to avoid service. Number 4. Attending college. Throughout the war, attending college offered a way to defer military service. Universities experienced an increase in enrollment, particularly between 1966 and 1969, when attendance grew by 4 to 6%. However, this option was largely available to white, middle and upper-class men, as tuition costs were prohibitive for many. The deferment system disproportionately affected minorities and working-class families, with Black Americans and low-income men being drafted at significantly higher rates. In 1971, the government began phasing out student deferments, restricting them to those studying medicine or theology. This policy change forced many students to either complete their education faster or face conscription. Number 5. Claiming a medical condition. Medical deferments became a widespread method for avoiding military service during the Vietnam War. Men sought 4F classifications, meaning they were unfit for service, by exaggerating or fabricating conditions. With the help of sympathetic doctors, many draft-eligible men secured exemptions for minor ailments. For example, Donald Trump famously cited bone spurs to avoid service, while Joe Biden obtained a deferment for childhood asthma. In total, nearly 500,000 men were granted medical deferments during the war, according to selective service records. Psychiatric evaluations also offered an avenue for draft avoidance. Some men intentionally exhibited erratic behavior during exams, while others exaggerated symptoms of anxiety or depression. Though homosexuality was technically grounds for disqualification, enforcement was inconsistent, and some gay men were still drafted. As the need for troops intensified, the military increasingly scrutinized medical deferments, leading to controversy and allegations of favoritism toward those with access to private healthcare. Number 6. Burning draft cards. Burning draft cards emerged as a powerful symbol of resistance during the Vietnam War. Although it was a federal crime under the 1965 amendment to the Selective Service Act, the act of publicly burning these cards garnered significant media attention and became a defining gesture of the anti-war movement. Some protesters also mailed their draft cards back to the Selective Service or refused to attend their pre-induction physical exams. By 1971, the Department of Justice was dealing with over 570,000 cases of draft non-compliance. However, federal prosecutors chose to focus on high-profile cases, resulting in the conviction of only 8,750 men and the imprisonment of 3,250. The symbolic power of draft resistance fueled anti-war sentiment, inspiring protests across the country and drawing attention to the moral and ethical issues surrounding conscription. Number 7. Fleeing the country. The introduction of the draft lottery in 1969 intensified efforts to evade conscription, leading thousands of men to flee the United States. Canada and Sweden became popular destinations, with estimates suggesting that between 40,000 and 100,000 Americans emigrated to avoid military service. Canada, in particular, welcomed draft resistors, with many settling in cities like Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal. Swedish authorities also provided asylum to those fleeing conscription. In 1977, President Jimmy Carter issued a pardon for non-violent draft evaders, allowing many to return to the U.S. However, some chose to remain abroad, having built new lives during their years in exile. As one resistor explained, "By the time I could come home, it no longer felt like home." The decision to flee the country was controversial, with some Americans viewing it as an act of cowardice and others as a principled stand against an unjust war. Number 8. Joining alternative service programs. Some young men avoided military service by volunteering for non-military programs like the Peace Corps and AmeriCorps. Although these programs did not guarantee deferments, they allowed participants to fulfill a form of public service that some draft boards viewed sympathetically. Thousands of men joined these programs during the war, hoping that their contributions would reduce their chances of being called for service. While not an official path to exemption, these efforts were generally respected by draft boards, especially in cases where participants worked in underserved communities or abroad. Number 9. Using political connections. Influential families often used political connections to secure favorable treatment from local draft boards, avoiding conscription for their sons. These boards had significant discretion over deferments, and those with wealth or social standing were able to sway decisions. For instance, George W. Bush was controversially assigned to the Texas Air National Guard, a post that minimized his chances of deployment. The perception of inequality within the draft system fueled public resentment, especially among working-class and minority communities, who were disproportionately conscripted. This disparity became a focal point for anti-war activists, contributing to the broader movement against the draft and highlighting the socio-economic divides that shaped the war effort. Number 10. Failing the mental fitness test. Mental fitness tests provided another way to avoid the draft. Some men deliberately behaved erratically during psychiatric evaluations, while others exaggerated conditions such as anxiety or depression. A 1970 report from the Selective Service indicated that 15% of medical rejections involved psychological conditions, though officials acknowledged that some of these claims were likely fraudulent. With psychiatrists under pressure to process large numbers of evaluations, decisions were often rushed, leading to inconsistencies in how psychological disqualifications were granted.